Hello. I thought we could talk a little bit today about John Clare, the English Romantic poet, and Enclosure, which was a thing that affected him and I think affects us all today, and our current political moment, our cultural moment, not just in the United States, but actually across the West, and may probably actually across the world because of the West. And so John Clare was a super interesting poet. Um, he was born in 1793 to a rural working class, or peasantry would be a better way to put it. Um, farm laborers. He was not a landowner, but his social class, they would work on farms and as day laborers, and they could scratch out a living that way. And at that time, there were still some places called the commons, and the commons were even where I'm right now, for instance, on my farm in Michigan. Across the road, it's actually some land that used to be part of this farm until the 1930s, I think, when they were, because of depression, the farmers were forced to sell to the state. And it's so appropriate. But this is the kind of place. There's a big meadow over there and some woods. There's actually a lot of maple trees, and there's an old sugar shack out there. Okay, here it's sticking up. Um, that this is the kind of place. So say myself and my neighbors, people on the other side of the woods, were we're farming on our own little plots, but we could use that land between us as the commons because nobody would own it, even though now the state owns it. And we could, make a deal between ourselves to graze our animals there, or who can use, what part, or what we'll do, so we can kind of come to an agreement. It's very communal approach to things. But what happened in England, starting actually uh, in the age of Henry VII, so it's 1500s, those common lands started to disappear as the government gave it to favored nobles, and these lands were enclosed by hedges or ditches or whatever, and the peasantry were no longer to have access to that land. And the thing is, in a lot of places, where the commons was not the greatest land, but these people would take care of it and they would put it into good tilth. And in fact, it was such a problem even in the 1500s that St. Thomas More, in his book Utopia, writes about it. And here's, I'll just read the passage and then I'll explain it. Uh, so he's the protagonist of Utopia is having a conversation with a cardinal. And the protagonist says, "Yet this is not the only circumstance that makes thieving necessary. There is another one, peculiar, as I see it, to the English people alone." "What is that?" asked the cardinal. "Your sheep," I replied. "They used to be so meek and eat so little. Now they are becoming so greedy and wild that they devour men themselves, as I hear. They devastate and pillage fields, houses, and towns. For in whatever parts of the land the sheep yield the softest and most expensive wool, there the nobility and gentry, yes, and even some abbots, though otherwise holy men, are not content with the old rents that the land yielded to their predecessors. Living in idleness and luxury, without doing any good to society, no longer satisfies them. They have to do positive evil, for they leave no land free for the plow. They enclose every acre for pasture. They destroy houses and abolish towns, keeping only the churches, and those for sheep barns." And it goes on, but it's pretty devastating critique, and good for him, right? Now, that has been um, the method since that time, and not just in all across the West and across the world, which is what the colonial powers did with Africa, for instance, or South America, or even North America. They enclosed those lands. And they do it legally. As the Marxist critic, I think he's great. I mean, no Marxist by a long shot, but E.P. Thompson talked about this, and I can't remember which book it is. That might be the History of the English Working Class. That this all happens legally by parliamentary law. They pass laws that favor themselves, right? And they enclose the lands of the peasantry. This is not anything new, right? They continue to do this. In fact, John Taylor Gatto, the educator in like the patron saint of American homeschooling, he mentioned this in terms of taxes in rural areas, like where I live, for instance. What happens is um, municipal boards get loaded with people from real estate or banking, and they start to change the tax laws, and then the taxes on farms are so expensive, and our taxes are very expensive, um, that the farmers are eventually forced to sell, and who they sell to? Developers. So this is also a form of enclosure, and it's and it's horrid. Now, sorry, a little choked up talking about this. Now with John Clare, who worked as this laborer, he is and even during his lifetime, he was published, and he was kind of celebrated as the English Robert Burns. And if you don't know Robert Burns, the great Scottish poet, he was the poet of the working class or the peasantry, and he wrote poetry about, like one of his famous poems, "To a Mouse," on digging his up nest while plowing, right? And but also he delved into peasant customs and also folklore, like I think he did a version of Tamlin, the famous fairy tale. Um, so John Clare, and this is at the time just after it's after Robert Burns, but where the Romantic movement is poeming, and he's coming a little bit later in the Romantic movement, a little younger than John Keats would have been. He was born in 1793. Um, but what happens with pardon me, what happens with Clare is, and there's a really good biography, by the way, about him. It's John Clare, a biography by, what's the guy's name? John Bate, which I read quite a few years ago. And it really opened my eyes to this period in history. Now, what happened with Clare, according to Bates' argument, is that because of enclosure, and it was harder for him to make a living, and he couldn't afford paper, and he had to make ink out of walnut hull juice, which is very caustic and eventually ate through the paper that he wrote his poems on. So he's a very poor guy. Um, and though very talented and kind of a atavistic poet, and we'll see that in a second. And what happened with him is, and this is Bates' argument, is that because of malnourishment, because of the enclosure laws, and because it was harder and harder to eke out a living, or an existence, I should say, because as the commons evaporated, um, Clare, and alcohol didn't help. Clare actually went mad. He lost his mind, and he was institutionalized for much of his life after adulthood. And he thought, for instance, that he thought he was Lord Byron. He was convinced he was Lord Byron, and he was convinced that the reason he was institutionalized is because he had two wives. He did not have two wives, but his mind broke, and we saw. I think we've seen a lot of that happen over the last almost 5 years with COVID. People's minds broke because of duress, and which is what Bates argues happened to Clare. But he lived. I mean, he lived till 1864, so he made it to almost 70, which isn't too bad for living in an institution. And according to Bates' description, and if you've read other descriptions of asylums back in the day, it was crazy. It was weird. I mean, it's wild. We can't even imagine. Probably the movie Amadeus, if you remember that movie, the scenes in the asylum at the beginning and the end with Salieri. That's pretty close to what it was like, and probably even crazier than that. But I wanted to read. It's a little bit longer than a usual poem that I would read. Uh, John Clare's poem, The Badger. And because I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I haven't read Clare in probably a year or so, but this poem has been on my mind. And The Badger is an interesting poem. It's a sonnet sequence. It's 5 sonnets. 1, 2, 3, yeah, 5. But it's not written in a traditional sonnet form. They're all written in couplets, and the rhythm is not perfect, not even close to perfect in some spots. But it is a very much. I don't want to degrade it or call it folk art, but I think folk art is a good thing. But it's, and don't want to call it amateurish either, because it's not, because you can tell this man is intelligent when he writes this poem, or when I read this poem, you tell how intelligent he was, and he's much more intelligent than you can think, even at the surface of the poem. So let me read the poem, and to preface it, I'll just say it just depicts a kind of thing that would go on in rural communities in England at the time. So this is the early 1800s. The Badger. The badger grunting on his woodland track, with shaggy hide and sharp nose scrubbed with black, roots in the bushes in the woods and makes a great hue barrow in the ferns and brakes. With nose on ground he runs an awkward pace, and anything will beat him in the race. The shepherd's dog will run him to his den, followed and hooted by the dogs and men. The woodmen, when the hunting comes about, go round at night to stop the foxes out. And hurrying through the bushes, ferns, and brakes, nor sees the many holes the badger makes. And often through the bushes to the chin breaks the old holes and tumbles headlong in. Some keep a baited badger tame as hog, and tame him till he follows like the dog. They urge him on like dogs and show fair play. He beats and scarcely wounded goes away. Lapped up as if asleep he scorns to fly, and seizes any dog that ventures nigh. Clapped like a dog he never bites the men, but worries dogs and hurries to his den. They let him out and turn a harrow down, and there he fights the host of all the town. He licks the patting hand and tries to play, and never tries to bite or run away. And runs away from noise and hollow trees, burnt by the boys to get a swarm of bees. When midnight comes, a host of dogs and men go out and track the badger to his den, and put a sack within the hole and lie till the old grunting badger passes by. He comes and hears they let the strongest loose. The old fox hears the noise and drops the goose. The poacher shoots and hurries from the cry. The old hare half wounded buzzes by. They get a forked stick to bear him down, and clap the dogs and bear him to the town, and bait him all the day with many dogs, and laugh and shout and fright the scampering hogs. He runs along and bites at all he meets. They shout and hollow down the noisy streets. He turns about to face the loud uproar, and drives the rebels to the very doors. The frequent stone is hurled where'er they go, when badgers fight and every one's a foe. The dogs are clapped and urged to join the fray. The badger turns and drives them all away. Though scarcely half as big, to mute and small, he fights with dogs for hours and beats them all. The heavy mastiff savage in the fray lies down and licks his feet and turns away. The bulldog knows his match and waxes cold. The badger grins and never leaves his hold. He drives the crowd and follows at their heels and bites them through. The drunkard swears and reels. The frighted women takes the boys away. The blackguard laughs and hurries on the fray. He tries to reach the woods in awkward race, but sticks and cudgels quickly stop the chase. He turns again and drives the noisy crowd, and beats the many dogs and noises loud. He drives away and beats them every one, and then they loose them all and set them on. He falls as dead and kicked by boys and men, then starts and grins and drives the crowd again, till kicked and torn and beaten out he lies, and leaves his hold and cackles, groans, and dies. I'll drink to that. Now here's the thing, right? Now it just might seem on the surface that what Claire's doing is just describing kind of the cruelty of the rural people and their kind of sports. I mean, this is a age where people still did bear baiting, right? Um, but I think it's much more than that. I think it's a weird metaphor or analogy even, um, because he's using a rural setting, but I don't think he's talking about rural matters. I think he's talking about governments in enclosure, and the badger becomes the symbol for the peasantry, because what happens to the badger, and he you can tell he admires the badger's fierceness and tenacity and cleverness. But that's the badger is the peasantry, and this is what basically the badger baiting that's going on here is what the nobility or the elites do to the peasantry in this instance, right? So it's really kind of, but that's why it's so strange because it's the peasantry where he's using the peasantry to illustrate. The peasantry represents the nobility or the elites, and the badger represents the peasantry, which is kind of so this is what I mean. I mean, John Clare is no dummy, right? He may have been crazy, but he wasn't stupid. And that's pretty powerful if you think about it. That he and the thing is that the badger fights and it actually wins all the way through, but finally at the end, till kicked and torn and beaten out, he lies and leaves his hold and cackles, groans, and dies. So, I think Claire is acutely aware of who holds the power in this situation, even though he admires the tenacity of the peasantry and of the badger. And it's really scary if you think about it. But I think this is what I think this is. I mean, it's not only is it going on now; it's always going on. It's been going on forever, right? Whether we see, how enclosure takes different names. Right now, for instance, not too far from here, I think maybe 10 miles away, the state of Michigan was trying to buy all these farms and put up solar panel farms, and which the peasantry or the local farmers and local people were fighting it. And I think temporarily, at least, the people have won, but um, the elites aren't going to stop. Right? You've probably seen these horrible images from Scotland where they cut down thousands of acres of trees to put up these gigantic solar farms, which is really insane if you think about it. I want to read a couple quotes from the book here. This is back to Bates. And here's what he says about enclosure. And I love this quote. This is from early in the book, about page 49. And Bates says, for many villagers, enclosure was experienced as an engine of social more than economic alienation. Use of the commons was technically a right restricted to those who occupied certain properties, but psychologically, the enclosed spaces were perceived as belonging to everyone. Enclosure was therefore symbolic of the destruction of an ancient birthright based on cooperation and common rights. And I think, I mean, that's how it's how it should be. But if you know the history of enclosure, one of the great figures of the enclosure wars over time was Gerard Winstanley in the 1600s, who was part of the diggers, the levelers, who were asserting the rights of the common people to the lands, right? Because I know this from experience. We run a CSA at our farm here. It's a very small CSA. It's a very small farm. We only have 10 acres, and we only farm or only garden on less than an acre. And we grow enough food in that little bit of space to feed 20 to 40 families through the growing season. So it's kind of, or at least for vegetables, I should say. And we actually raise enough meat for ourselves on this little plot that we have with a couple small pastures. So it's doable, right? But with enclosure, and this is what happened with enclosure throughout the 18th century and 19th century, is people can't eke out an existence on a little bit of land anymore. And so they're thrown off the land. Where do you got to go? Well, you got to go make a living. So where do they go? They go into the cities, where, and this is what if you read Charles Dickens, and this is a big thing that happens with Dickens, is you see the repercussions of enclosure as country people were forced in the cities to find and make a living, and it's basically slavery, right? And cholera spreads, prostitution thrives, alcoholism thrives because people are alienated. And this is exactly what Bates is talking about here, the psychological alienation that happens, that is part and parcel of the economic alienation. And I would argue that what we've been seeing over the last 4 or 5 years is precisely this. It's both psychological alienation, which, when people are closed up in their homes, I mean, what is more psychologically alienating than that? Which is accompanied by a kind of economic alienation, and we've seen that across the world, or especially the West, over the last few years. And here's another quote. He quotes E.P. Thompson, whom I mentioned earlier. And here's what Thompson says: Clare may be described without hindsight as a poet of ecological protest. He was not writing about man here and nature there, but lamenting a threatened equilibrium in which both were involved. Right? And I mean, that's what I've been in my work for a long time. I've been trying to assert a case for that equilibrium between man and nature. Actually, and because I'm not a Marxist, I can throw God in there too. Between God or Sophia with man and nature, because I think that's the only healthy way to proceed. It's the only healthy way for human beings to live. Everything else breeds pestilence and disease, as we saw with Enclosure, when people were forced into the cities, which breed pestilence, disease, and prostitution. You really don't see a lot of that in the countryside. And I'll end. There's a little quote they have from one of Clare's poems here. That Bates dropped. So I'll read that, and then we'll end with that. By Langley bush I roam, but the bush hath left its heel. On Cowper hill I stray, 'tis a desert strange and chill. And spreading lee close oak, ere decay had penned its will, to the axe of the spoiler and self-interest fell a prey. And Crossbury way, and old Round Oak's narrow lane, with its hollow trees like pulpits, I shall never see again. Enclosure like a Bonaparte, let not a thing remain. It levelled every bush and tree, and levelled every hill, and hung the moles for traitors, though the brook is running still. It runs a naked brook, cold and chill. All right, so thanks for thanks for watching, and drop a like if you like it, or share it with somebody if you would like to, and hopefully we'll do this again soon. All right, God bless.